My neighbor pulled an antenna out of my yard at dawn and smiled like she'd won something. That's the short version. The part one told myself for the first week because it sounded almost too ridiculous to be true. But then the text started, the flyers appeared on stoops, and an SUV parked like a thread at the end of our cul-de-sac. By the time it was over, I had a pile of photos, a handful of recordings, and a community meeting that landed in a courtroom-level meltdown. This is how a small neighborhood conflict turned into a public spectacle. My name is Ethan Cole. I like simple things, black coffee at 7, my toolbox under the bench, and tinkering with harmless gadgets in the garage. I built a little weather antenna to track storms and test an old hobby. It sat on a short pole in my side yard. The cable ran into the garage, and for months no one thought much of it. From my kitchen window, it stuck up like a lone reed, and that is what finally drew my neighbor Marjorie Hale's attention. Marjorie was the kind of HOA president who carried the weight of the neighborhood around her like an armor. She wore pearls to every meeting and spoke with a calm certainty that made people assume she was right. One morning, she marched across the lawn, ripped the antenna from the ground, held the broken pole aloft, and declared it a public safety hazard. She staged a photo and sent it to the neighborhood group, and suddenly my quiet little project was an alleged menace. At first, the reaction was small and petty. Heated messages in the group chat, a formal HOA notice posted on the community board. But repetition turned attention into belief. Overnight, my mailbox had a taped safety advisory. Someone left a battery-powered speaker at the end of my driveway with a note that read, "For the community's eyes." Someone slipped a handwritten complaint slip into my mailbox. The whole thing slid from online outrage to physical intimidation. Marjorie framed it as protection. She sent an urgent email to every homeowner and called for immediate measures. Because she sounded so sure, 2 black SUVs showed up one afternoon and parked at the end of the street. Men in plain clothes asked polite, measured questions about the device. I handed them my permit, the invoice, the schematic, the boring paperwork that proves a thing is legal. They took notes and left. Things escalated. At an HOA meeting, Marjorie pushed for rule changes that would give her more authority to remove hazards without broad community approval. She used glossy petitions and photo ops to make her point, and she pressured people behind the scenes. One evening, she came to my door with a stack of papers and told me in a steady voice that the neighborhood could not tolerate my antenna. I told her the device was perfectly legal, that it had been inspected, and that it helped my hobby and community projects. Neighbors began to take sides. People I'd waved to for years read Marjorie's bullet points and decided she must be right. A handful of residents stood up at the meeting and asked about permits and due process, and you could actually see some minds begin to change. But fear moves faster than facts. Someone slipped a fake citation under my door at 2 in the morning that read, "Unauthorized device." Someone sabotaged my sprinkler and fiddled with the breaker in my box. I found footprints across the flower bed late at night. There was a moment I thought about walking away, or at least packing the antenna into the truck and pretending it never happened. But I saved everything. I photographed the broken pole, I uploaded the meeting audio, and I sent copies of HOA notices to a friend who works as a paralegal. The antenna stopped being a hobby and became a record, a small stubborn proof that someone could take a simple fact and twist it into a story. Then I decided to push back in a way I had resisted until then. I released the raw audio from an HOA meeting. In that recording, Marjorie accused me of spying and waved a screenshot she claimed was proof. The audio preserved other details: hushed comments, a neighbor who muttered that she was overstepping, and the exact moment when Marjorie admitted she had called extra people to look into my device. Once the tape was public, the story she'd built began to crack, and the community started asking different questions. I remember the night I finally confronted Marjorie in front of a half-circle of neighbors. She held the loudspeaker like a scepter and said, "This is about your respect for our community." I stepped forward and said, "Respect is earned, not staged. You ripped this down in my yard like you were delivering a judgment." Her smile hardened. "You don't understand what's at stake here," she snapped. "We can't have devices like that." "Then bring the proof," I said. "Don't bring the theater. If this is real, present the evidence. If it isn't, apologize." The crowd murmured. She stared at me in silence, then raised her voice and accused me of defiance. That exchange, sharp and public, told me how much of this was performance and how little was fact. The most cinematic part came later, a late-night sequence that looks stranger in hindsight than it felt at the time. A robocall went out across the neighborhood with a distorted warning. Dangerous device. Report immediately. Headlights cut down the street. People came out in robes with phones in hand, and Marjorie showed up with a loudspeaker as if she were staging a raid. I stood on my porch and watched her amplify fear and make it feel urgent. Fear is performative. When someone acts like danger is at the gate, others start to believe they are in danger. Not long after that, the federal agents returned with more formal questions. They showed up with case numbers and a meticulous way of doing things. They took copies of documents, listened to recordings, and asked who had signed petitions and where evidence had originated. After reviewing the paper trail and witness statements, the officers escorted Marjorie out of a meeting when it became clear parts of her case were fabricated. It was not a dramatic arrest scene like on TV. It was quiet, procedural, and final. What surprised me through all of this was how human the situation felt. Marjorie was not a cartoon villain. She was someone invested in a version of the neighborhood that made sense to her. Pride, status, the invisible currency of property values, these things make people act in ways that can look cruel, but are rooted in fear. Her certainty was a shield. She used to keep things as she wanted them to be. Understanding that did not excuse what she did, but it helped me stop seeing everything in black and white. After the dust settled, the neighborhood was quieter and the consequences were tangible. Some neighbors kept their distance. Others brought casseroles with shy apologies. The HOA restructured, putting in clearer checks and procedures so one person could not wield so much unilateral power. I sold the antenna and donated the proceeds to a local shelter, not as a surrender, but as a way to turn the episode into something useful. The black SUVs never came back, and the robocalls finally stopped. If there is a lesson in this, it is both simple and stubborn. Document everything, but also listen. Confidence is contagious, and people often prefer a tidy story to a messy truth. If someone speaks loudly and with certainty, ask for proof. Ask for permits. Record the meeting. Trust in small communities is fragile. When it breaks, it erodes in repeated assertions until there is a pile of evidence and a lot of regret. So here's where I'll leave it. I'm still on Pine Hollow, still drinking black coffee at 7, still fixing the fence when it needs it. I tell this because you might have your own version of community conflict. What would you have done in my shoes? Was I right to stand my ground, or should I have walked away to save my peace? Drop a comment below, tell me where you're from, and share your take on justice, on fairness, and on how communities should handle disagreements without turning them into performances that hurt real people. If this struck a chord, share it with someone who lives in an HOA or with anyone who cares about community fairness. I'd love to hear your story.